Right, morning everyone. As Phil said, thanks Phil for inviting me to give this speech, and it's quite exciting to have a whole day talking about diversity and human capital issues. I would say a year ago we wouldn't necessarily have had a day like this, so it's a really important step forward, I think. Diversity can be a bit of an emotive topic. I'm going to try and keep it light but to the point, and also set a few challenges to you guys in the room as we go through the presentation. So, what is diversity? It's the elephant in the room. I think for a long time, publishing, particularly academic publishing, has not been particularly diverse. That may still be true today. And I think it's something that we need to start talking more about. So that's what I'm here to do. What's diversity about? For me, it's about social justice. And I think of that in terms of the distribution of wealth, opportunities and privileges within a society, and I particularly want to keep that word opportunities in mind as we go on through the presentation, because I think we need to think quite hard about who we give opportunities to as an industry. So what I haven't got time to do in this presentation is go in depth into all the different areas of diversity, but I'm going to try and touch on various different areas as we go through to talk about how those opportunities and those lack of opportunities might impact different groups. So, keep in mind, for me, diversity is about social justice, and I would say that's something we should all be signing up to. But if you still remain to be convinced, there is obviously a business case for diversity as well. I mean, I haven't put loads and loads of data up because I'm sure many of you will know it all, but this is from McKinsey analysis of a few years ago, which says that 15% gender diverse companies are 15% more likely to outperform their sector averages in terms of bottom line profit. Ethnically diverse companies, 35% more likely to outperform their competitors. So there's a real business imperative as well here. But as we know, society is changing fast. So I want to talk a little bit about the kind of world that we're now in and the workforce that we're going to see coming through in the next few years. So you probably won't be able to read this because it's a bit blurry, but I just wanted to pick out a couple of things. So when we're talking about millennials, there's a bit of debate around the timings, as there always are with these things, but it's roughly those born 1980 to mid-1990s. So the kind of people that are going to be entering the workforce in the next few years. And there's some demographic data on here about the kind of things that define millennials, but I wanted to pick up particularly on the right-hand side the 5 things that make millennials unique. One of which is clothes and fashion. So you're all told if you're not a millennial, you're not interested in clothes and fashion. But it's quite important to note that libertarianism and tolerance is in that top 5. So millennials are a tolerant generation. And Generation Z, again, some debate over the dates, but born 1990s to mid-2000s. So they'll be coming into the workforce, let's say, in the next decade. I won't read you all these stats, but you can see that there's a real difference, perhaps, from when people like myself went to university or entered the workforce. 96% of millennials own a smartphone, 63% prefer to see real people in adverts, and over 50% of children are expected to be of a minority race or ethnic group by 2020. That's not very far away. So there's a real changing social demographic that we need to be thinking about. Millennials are also diverse, racially tolerant and racially progressive. There's some US research from the Pew Research Center done a few years ago, I think it's 2010, based on more than 2 decades of data analysing people's attitudes to race, and their conclusion was that the younger generation is more racially tolerant than their elders, and possibly the most tolerant generation in history. The millennials and those coming through the system now are also very interested in transgender rights. So Ipsos, BuzzFeed and the Williams Institute at UCLA Law School interviewed people globally and asked about transgender rights. So they were asking about things like, should transgender people be protected from discrimination? Should transgender people be allowed to have surgery? Should they be allowed to adopt children? Should they be allowed to use the bathroom of the gender that they identify with? So lots and lots of questions about how transgender people should be treated. And you'll see here that from the answers they got, which is sort of most of the big economies, the UK came in 5th with very, very high expectations that transgender rights should be protected. So over about 73% of people questioned were in favour of protecting those rights for transgender people. So, people entering the workforce now are driven by influencers and not by authority figures. They live and have always lived in a globally connected world, and I think we need to really appreciate the difference of that. And their values may be different. There's some evidence to suggest that they value career capital and life experiences more highly than pay and rewards, although I will come back to the question of pay later, because I think it's an important one for us to think about. So, the workforce of the future sees diversity as a hygiene factor, not a differentiator. That workforce will expect diversity as a standard. They will expect to see themselves represented in every layer of the organisation and at all levels, and they'll view that level of social justice as a high priority. So what does this mean for all of us? Well, I think we need to think about the world of work that this generation is going to be expecting. So I don't know if you're familiar with Atom Bank, but it's a startup bank based in Durham. It started about a year ago. They've won a lot of awards for fintech innovation. And it's a purely app-based bank, so there's no branches, there's no infrastructure, everything's done through an app. You can't even apply for an account on the website. So it's a very different kind of working environment, but I think there's an important point here that you can see from that video, yes, there's some horrible cliches in there of them all playing table tennis and, you know, that dancing around and that kind of thing, but this is the reality of the world of work that people are starting to expect. And my sense is that they expect this, and when they come into publishing, they get this. And I think that's a problem for us. I think we have to be realistic about who we're competing with in the future to bring people into the industry. So I think part of the problem we have is this. We talk a lot in the industry about innovation. We talk about thinking differently, but we don't really mean completely differently. We mean kind of a bit differently, but still be a bit like me. And if you're sitting there thinking that that's not you or your organisation, I think we need to think about the term cultural fit, which is a term that gets bandied around a lot. You know, is this person a good cultural fit? Will they fit with our culture? Well, the question is, should they fit with your culture? I think there's a question in my mind about where cultural fit ends and bias begins. So how much of that is bias and how much of it is a genuine concern for how well that first person will fit in your organisation? And I challenge you all to think about that a little bit. And that matters, that issue of cultural fit matters, because if you're familiar with Peter Drucker, which I'm sure many of you are, he famously said, culture eats strategy for breakfast. So I could stand here and give you a really great diversity strategy that you could all go home and implement. But the important thing is that you think about the culture that you have in your organisations and how that impacts on the people who work there. How relevant is the culture of your organisation? Okay, maybe you don't want table tennis tables, but what aspects of that working environment that you've just seen might appeal to people, and how much of it do you really have in your organisation? So, where are we now in publishing? I'm going to caveat this section with two things. One, there are some charts coming, but since you're an STM audience, I think you'll probably cope with that. Secondly, the second caveat is that publishing data on diversity is really, really hard to get at the moment, which tells you something in itself, that we're not even really holding ourselves to account on this point. But I've tried to get data around the creative industries or relevant industries. Not all of it is publishing specific, but it's usually the closest that I can find. So thinking about ethnicity, you're probably aware of Creative Access. They're a charity that works with young people from ethnic minority backgrounds to help them get into the creative industries. And they did some work 3 or 4 years ago looking at the kind of demographic of London and the demographic of the creative industries in terms of race. So in London, we are 60% white, 40% black and minority ethnic. In the creative industries, we're nearly 100% white. That figure is actually, I think, 5.4% black and minority ethnic people in the creative industries as a whole. And that figure's actually been going down over the past few years. So that's a pretty big gap that we need to start thinking about filling. Won't surprise many people here to hear there's research proving in the US that the publishing industry is overwhelmingly white and female. So there's already a sort of shocking and indisputable disparity of opportunity, going back to that question of opportunity for black and minority ethnic people in the creative industries, and that relates to us as well, of course. It's harder to get data on class, but there is also evidence that people from working class backgrounds are similarly disadvantaged. They face discrimination in the workplace. And the Social Mobility Commission estimates that they're paid on average £7,000 a year less than those from a more privileged background. So again, I think there's things for us to think about there. Moving on to my particular personal bugbear of gender parity. This does remain a big issue, and particularly for us as an industry, which estimates are that it's about 70% female as an industry, but I think you'd be hard-pressed to find many companies where the senior team is 70% female. So this is some research from the FTSE 100 last year, financial year 2016. They looked at the FTSE 100 companies and counted the number of women and the number of men. There were 8 men called David, 7 men called Stephen, and 6 women in total. So there are more Davids than women in FTSE 100 leadership roles, and that's an issue for us, I think. So we've got to think about that leaky pipeline. Even when we've got people into the industry, why aren't we getting them to the top roles? And again, yes, this is FTSE 100 data, but I think if you think about your organisations, you'll probably see some truth in that for your organisations as well. So my message, I guess, is we can't be complacent. I think there's a risk in our industry because we're all very clever people, because we're all quite well educated and we think we're quite liberal and we're quite tolerant, that we're not really facing up to these issues, whether that's through political correctness, not wanting to say the wrong thing, or just thinking, well, it's a meritocracy, we're all here because we're very bright. And I think we have to really challenge that. I think publishing is guilty of perpetuating the problem, sometimes even more so than some of the industries we perhaps judge ourselves to be superior to. So if you think about banking and the legal profession, they've done a lot of work in recent years to address some of these issues. They've been much more upfront about tackling issues of ethnic diversity and gender progression through the ranks than we have. So things that we can think about as employers. Attraction, I won't read this out, but there's a lot of research about how the wording of job ads can affect who applies for them. Women won't apply for, or less likely to apply for jobs that ask them to be assertive, independent, aggressive, and so on. And that's largely because women are trained and conditioned from a young age not to be any of those things, but to be well-behaved and polite and quiet and all of those things. So if you're putting those words into your job ad, you're immediately cutting your talent pool in half, potentially. There's also some interesting research that looking at job adverts, men will apply for a job if they meet 60% of the criteria in the job ad. Women won't apply unless they meet 100% of the criteria. So again, there's a real issue about specifying what you want in that advert and being clear about which of those things are really essential and which of those are nice to have, because if you're asking for all these qualities to be essential, you're going to get a lot of men who think they've got all those things all close enough. You're going to get a lot of women who think, actually, I'm only halfway there, perhaps I'm not ready for this role yet. And the same issues apply in an ethnic diversity context. This is very recent research, which I've got the reference there if anybody wants to go and look into it. It shows that ethnic minority candidates are less likely to apply where a character is described as a personality trait. A characteristic is described as a personality trait and not a behaviour. So if you say, you must be highly creative, as opposed to, you must be able to think creatively or you must be able to work in a creative environment, ethnic minority candidates are less likely to apply for those roles. So small things in thinking about how you state those requirements and how definite you are about needing them can make a big difference to who's even going to apply. So these are people who right now you don't even know about because they're not even getting past the application stage. And then retention. I said I wanted to come back to the issue of pay because I think it's not articulated very well in this industry, the issues that we have around pay. So talking a little bit about the data from the book Career Salary Survey and how that compares to the wider world. The average starting salary in publishing, according to this year's survey, was just over £20,000. The average overall salary, so that's including anyone at more senior levels who took that survey, is about £32,000. The average London salary is £35,000. So we're behind the curve here. And if you look at the difference between the overall salaries, that's kind of a 10% difference. Now, if you were looking at a role in publishing versus a role in a fintech bank or some other organisation, you're going to take this into consideration. And what's that worth? Well, it would get you a mortgage of 100k. I'm sure many of you here live in London, Cambridge, Oxford, big cities that are quite expensive. That's the average house price in London. So, you know, we're setting people up for a future where they're not going to ever be able to afford to buy a house in the cities we expect them to work in. And of course, you know, I was one of the lucky ones who left university with very small debt, and largely because I wanted to go travelling, so I took a loan out to do that. How lucky was I in retrospect? But obviously that's not the case now, and current estimates suggest that the average student debt now is £50,000. That's a huge sum. And if you're from a working class background, it's likely to be even higher. The evidence suggests that working class students come out with about £57,000 worth of debt. And then when you consider the likelihood that they'll be paid less as well, that's a real issue building up. So you come out of university with your £50,000 debt, you look at a publishing salary. Well, it's going to take me 30 years to repay that debt. That feels like quite a long time to a 23-year-old or a 24-year-old, particularly when we're also saying, by the way, you'll never get a mortgage on this salary. So, you know, just pay off your debts and then you won't have anywhere to live, but you'll have a bit more money in your pocket. So I think there are issues that we need to think about here in terms of the way that we structure our industry. A little bit on inclusion. Disabled people are twice as likely to be unemployed as non-disabled people. I've worked in a lot of publishers. I've very rarely seen disabled people working there, one or two exceptions, but it's quite rare. And that disability employment gap really hasn't changed for over a decade, so there's a big, big problem that we're not facing up to here, and there's a big talent pool that we're not accessing. And I don't really think we've got much excuse. There's research that shows that most accommodations for disabled workers are relatively low cost and that they have other positive impacts in the workplace in terms of innovation, creativity, and job satisfaction. So I don't think there's an excuse really for us not to be making those accommodations. And finally, going on to retention and development, I want to spend a bit of time on this because it's something that I think is quite important. We've seen a lot of programs put into place to bring women up through the leadership ranks, and usually what happens is they get a mentor. So they receive a mentor, the mentor works with them on how they can develop their skills, how they can get to that next level. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. The problem is that men get champions. So there's a 2008 survey by Catalyst, which is a really interesting organisation, if you don't know them, who do a lot of research in this area. And they looked at 4,000 full-time employed men and women who they considered high potentials. They were largely MBA graduates from top universities. And what that showed was that women were paid less, they occupied lower level positions, they had less career satisfaction, and even when you factored in things like their industry, their prior work experience, and their aspirations, and whether they had children, those factors still remained. What was interesting was among that group, many of those women had mentors, many, many more than the men, but it wasn't getting them as far as the men were getting. So I think, to me, this speaks to the way that we expect the different genders to behave in the workplace. Women are given mentors to kind of fix them. Oh, this is how you need to get to that next level. This is what you need to do differently. This is how you need to behave to reach that goal. But men get champions. That's not someone giving you any advice. That's just someone in the boardroom going, Dave is great, we should really think about him for this project, or Fred's definitely right for a promotion or whatever. And there's a lot of data about how men are much more likely to get champions than women are, and that sponsorship and championing has a much more positive effect on career outcomes. So there's a double issue going on there, I think. So what can we do? That's all the bad news. Now let's think about what we can do. So remember, going back to Peter Drucker and culture, we do need to think about the cultures that we have in our organisations and in our industry. So what stories do we tell ourselves about who we are? Some of you will be familiar with this culture web, I'm sure. What symbols represent our organisations, particularly an issue for university presses, which often look quite kind of formal and intimidating in their outside presentation? What are the power structures that we have in the organisation? And that's not so much org charts as who holds the power, which departments always get their way when there's a bun fight over money, editorial. What organisational structures are in place, what control systems are in place, how much autonomy do people have to do their role, and what are the rituals and routines that we have. And I think So all of this adds up to the paradigm of the organisation, and of course at an industry level this is true as well. So what I think is important about this is it gives you a way to think about the culture of your organisation, and then it gives you the tools to think which aspects of this might be putting people off from coming to work here, which might be forming a barrier to some of that talent pool that we want to try and access, and how can we shift that to open those doors a bit wider. So I definitely recommend going back and doing this because it's quite good fun as well. So think about the culture, think about how you can change it, because there's no point bringing into your organisation a more diverse pool of people if they're not going to feel included. So those cultural changes have to be part of your programme. We also need to think as an industry about how we recruit. Where are we recruiting? Are we recruiting only through universities, or do we ever go to schools? Do we go to sixth form colleges? Do we recruit outside the major cities that probably most of us work in? Which websites, which online marketplaces are we advertising through? Which blogs? Are we reaching a diverse range of people? Thinking about that language that I've touched on, how are we structuring our job ads? How are we thinking about what requirements we have? And how can we support candidates from poorer backgrounds? If you're going to go off and try and recruit from cities outside of where you are, can you support candidates? Can you cover their travel expenses for an interview, or do a virtual interview by video conference rather than expecting them to travel? So, you know, small things, maybe a bit of cost in some of them, but not huge. And that will just widen that talent pool a bit further. And as I touched on, think about your priorities. It's very, very common, although less so now, but when I started working at Cambridge University Press about 8 years ago, every job ad had must be educated to degree level in the advert, and it was a real battle to get that taken out. I mean, I was recruiting people into production roles. I didn't think that a degree was essential for that, but it was a real battle to get HR to take that off the job adverts. Now, that's not true anymore, but, you know, that's not that long ago. And I think we need to really question whether it says more about our own bias than about the nature of the role that we're recruiting for. Now, undoubtedly, there are some roles in publishing that need subject matter expertise. But is it all of them? Which is it really? And if you really think that that role requires a degree in a particular subject, how can you support a more diverse range of people into getting that qualification? Can you offer work and study programs? Can you offer sponsorship? Can you give people flexible working so they can study on their own time? What can we do to make sure we're not just recruiting in our own image? And think about the publishing jargon that you use in your adverts and how off-putting that might be to someone trying to get into the industry. Do they understand what all those terms mean, or are they just going to think, I don't know what any of this is, so I'm not going to apply for that role, even if they were probably competent to do it? And if you're interested in this, there's quite a lot of free online resources you can use to check your job ads, and they will flag particular types of language which are off-putting. There's a website called Textio, which is definitely worth a look. That's actually chargeable, but you can usually get a month's free trial to just play with it and put some of your standard job ads through. And if you just Google gender-sensitive job ads and things like that, you'll get a lot of websites that you can just paste your text into, and it will red flag anything that it sees as potentially putting candidates off. So these are not difficult things for us to do, but we need to put a bit more thought into it, I think. And develop more effective support systems. So I talked a little bit about mentoring already. I don't want to suggest that mentoring is a bad thing, because on an individual level it can be really beneficial. But if we really want to move the dial on diversity, particularly moving people up into senior teams, we need to think about sponsorship and championing as part of that structure, as well as mentorship. And we need to think about whether mentorship is being equally applied to everyone, or are we singling people out to say you need some mentoring or you're not going to get there, and what impact might that have on those people? Does your organisation do enough to support people with caring responsibilities, people with disabilities, people who need to relocate, people who are studying? Are there things that you can do to support people with a different range of personal backgrounds and personal interests? So, in summary, social justice matters. It matters to me personally, and I'm sure it matters to many people in the room. The data suggests that organisations that pursue it will benefit, but that's not really the message I want to put across today. We need to care about diversity because it's the right thing to do. And I've been in this industry 20 years. I love it and hate it in equal measure, but one of the things that I love about it is that people in this industry care and they want to do the right thing, and we take our responsibilities seriously in terms of what we publish, how we publish. Let's start taking our workforce as seriously as we take those issues. So let's think about all of these things as we go back to our roles. So here's my call to action for you all. When you get back to your office, your workplace, whether it's tomorrow or next week, just look around, look at those symbols, look at those stories that you're telling yourself. Think about how someone would feel coming into that environment who perhaps didn't have a university degree or wasn't from the same background as you or was in a wheelchair or any of those issues. How would that person feel? How included would they feel? How welcome would they feel? Because even if you get those people in for interview, if they walk in and they're terrified of the place because it looks terribly formal and everybody speaks in a particular way, they're not going to perform well in the interview. And of course, then that's going to confirm your bias that you can't employ people who don't have degrees because they can't do interviews. And, it's a vicious circle, basically. Other things that I think we need to be doing is challenging our senior teams. Do you reflect the organisation as a whole? Do you reflect the demographics of where we are as a whole? And what could we do more around that? I've talked about job adverts. How are you structuring those? Where are you going? How are you writing them? I think there's an onus on all of us as well to think about our responsibilities. If we're accepting invitations to conferences, to give speeches, that kind of thing, to sit on a panel, are we asking about the diversity of that panel? Are we making sure that everybody's got a shot at being on that panel and that it's not going to just be the same 4 people who are always on that panel at London Book Fair or Frankfurt or wherever? So I think we all have a personal responsibility here, I guess is what I'm saying, and I don't think many of these things are that hard to do. So what steps can you take? What steps can your colleagues take? What small things can you do in your organisation to start moving this forward? And I think, if we had everyone in this room, everyone who was at the Diversity Day at Frankfurt, we could really make a big difference. So that's it. Let's build a better publishing world.